Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining ECD's webinar for clergy and professional development. We're so thankful that you've joined us today. Today, we're going to have an amazing time with Dr. Michael Jordan from Houghton University. But before we introduce him, I want to also introduce a representative from Houghton University, one of our Wesleyan schools, a great place to be at any time of the year, but especially now with the leaves changing. It's one of the most beautiful campuses you'll ever visit. So joining us today is Rebecca, one of their admissions team members. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Carla. Hello, everyone. I really just wanted to take a moment to invite you to encourage the high school students in your life, whether they live in your homes or they're in your churches or just in your circles, really to just consider attending a Christian college and, of course, more specifically to check out Houghton. We are so deeply committed to providing a Christ-centered education that is academically excellent. We really don't want students to think that you have to choose between the two. You should really be able to go to a top tier school in an environment where your faith is not only accepted, but encouraged and really supported and nurtured. And have really high quality faculty like Dr. Jordan that you're going to be hearing from in a moment that are really deeply committed to their Christian faith and supporting you. We're also deeply committed to affordability. We want anyone that wants to attend a Christian college to be able to go to one. So a couple years ago, we lowered our tuition by 50%. And then we also started the Founders Promise Scholarship, which is a last dollar scholarships for students that are Pell eligible. Your tuition is completely covered for you. And then for any of you who may be Houghton alumni, I wanted to be sure to let you know that you can become an alumni ambassador. And through that program, you have the opportunity to give students in your life a $500 scholarship to Houghton. So we'll share the link on how you can become an alumni ambassador in the chat so you can learn a little bit more about that. And then just the last thing that I wanted to say was that we also have a really great early college program. So high school juniors and seniors, you can start now taking online classes through Houghton. It's only $60 a credit, and it's a really great way for students to just sample Houghton and check it all out. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're so grateful for Houghton and its commitment to higher education, being a member of the Wesleyan Church, and any person that I have met that is part of Houghton has come from Houghton has been a delight. So it would be a great choice for any student. We thank you for joining us. And as we've said, one of the amazing instructors, faculty members there is Reverend Dr. Michael Jordan. So welcome today, Dr. Jordan. I would love to introduce you to everyone. Maybe they're familiar with you, maybe they are not. So let me share with everyone listening, if you will, just a quick bio, because you just have an amazing background and an amazing ministry at Houghton. Dr. Houghton is joining us. He is a graduate with his PhD from Drew University, and he's a professor of theology at Houghton University currently. From 2002 to 2009, he was the pastor of Exton Community Baptist Church in Exton, Pennsylvania. And for the years 2013-2014, he served as the dean of the chapel at Houghton before moving over to teach full-time this fall. Over the summer, he's also on staff as the chaplain for Camp of the Woods, which is a Christian camp in the Adirondack Mountains. Now, all of that is wonderful, but I always think this second part is probably the most important. He is married to his wonderful wife, Jill, who is a mathematician and also teaches at Houghton. They live just off campus, and they have 5 children: Grace, Jack, Lucy, Gabriel, and Anne. And in his spare time, Mike enjoys singing, crossword puzzles, and distance running. I cannot share that with you, Mike, but I'm glad you enjoy it. And he is a fan of Philadelphia professional and college sports. Are you going to sing the Eagles song for us today?
I will spare you, but I am an obnoxious, almost degenerate Philadelphia Eagles fan. So thank you for the invite anyway.
Well, you're welcome. They're a great team. So I'll share that with you. But please share with us what you have to say on worship in the age of anxiety.
Thanks so much, Carla. This is really a privilege for me, and I really appreciate you all taking some time to think about this. I know when it comes to worship, everyone has opinions, everyone has very important experiences that they've had in their lives. So we tend to feel really strongly about the way that we worship, and we have really keen ideas. Part of what drew me to the field of liturgical studies was wanting to examine those a little more. When I was a local church pastor, because I wasn't raised in the Wesleyan church, I didn't really receive very much instruction about worship. And so I really wanted to learn a little more about the kind of historical foundations of Christian worship. Like when I was a young pastor, I found myself just kind of like making decisions based on what felt right in the moment. I found myself kind of Googling things like, what do you say and do at a wedding? Those kinds of things. And I thought there's got to be a little more there. So it led me to a pretty rigorous degree program where I wanted to dig in and learn more about the historical foundations of Christian worship. And so I tend to be one of the worship guys in the Wesleyan world now that I'm part of the Wesleyan Church, and I love it. I think there's a lot of really good, interesting scholarship and thinking and practitioners right now in the Wesleyan Church around the area of worship. So anyway, it's my privilege to be one of them, and this book is a little piece of that. I'm gonna go ahead and just share a screen so you can see a picture of the book. I want you to recognize it in case you want to buy it online. So anyway, this book's called Worship in an Age of Anxiety, and it was really born out of this sense of, how do I say this? I really cared about the young people that I was meeting who were dealing with anxiety, some of whom would call themselves anxious, some of those who wouldn't. But I was a Houghton student in the late 90s, and the way that we processed anxiety and talked about it then was really different than the way that kids process it now. And I began to realize that as I worked with young people, just how much they cared about Jesus, and also how they were on kind of a mental health journey. And somehow those two things didn't seem to overlap. Like in one way they sort of they had this mental health world over here that was about like, okay, I'm aware of the things that trigger me to feel anxious. I'm aware of those things. And over here they had Jesus and this kind of sense of, I know that he loves me, I know that he cares, but they had trouble really integrating those two things. And for me, that naturally took place in the form of worship, where I'd see students who would be worshiping God in very kinds of like deep and heartfelt ways. You could see them raising their hands, closing their eyes. So in one sense, it seemed like they were feeling fine, right? But on the other, they would talk about how they were depressed, they were anxious, and the two just didn't really seem to come together. And so when I was approached by IVP to like write something for this series called Dynamics of Christian Worship, and this series is kind of like halfway between pastoral and academic, anxiety was really front of mind for me. And so we talked about this as an idea for the book. And so that's what I have been working on, and primarily, wrote it the last couple of years, and then it was published this past June. So glad to share it all with you, and I'll walk through some of the main kind of content that's in the book. And again, we'll be glad. I assume that people who are on will be able to access this later, but if not, I can certainly arrange to share PowerPoints with you through Carla if that's helpful.
And
So,
I'd like to say,
yeah,
sorry, Michael, I'd
you're
like
fine.
to say, just as he's presenting, as you are, if you have a question, and you're joining us live, please put that in the chat, in the comments, and we will ask that. I don't like to interrupt people, but I will interrupt you with any question that we have, because this is such an essential topic, not just for today, right? This has been important, but now we're addressing it in a fresh way. So if you have any question, please put that in the comments, and then I will ask that of Dr. Jordan. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I'm very interruptible. I love that. So no worries at all. Just a little bit about anxiety, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So anxiety is what we call a future-oriented mood state, by which I mean it's about kind of our concern about what could happen. Some of you have seen Inside Out 2, and the character anxiety simply spirals around thinking about what might happen. And in some ways, that's a useful skill to have, to anticipate what might happen. In fact, I'm using it right now, right? I'm thinking about, like, what are they all thinking out there and what might be helpful for them to hear? And if I say this, what will they think of that? And so being able to do that's really good. But there's a problem when it kind of spirals out of control and we start thinking about what might happen and we can't really do anything about it. And all of us know what it's like to be anxious sometimes, where we're, laying in bed and thinking about all the things that might happen in the morning. And we somehow think, like, if I just think about it a little more, if I just turn it over in my head in another way, maybe I'll be able to kind of control how it turns out. But we know that's not how it turns out. For most of us, we experience that sometimes, but most of the time it doesn't really trouble us. But for people with clinical anxiety, this is a constant reality. They're always thinking about what might happen. Anxiety is rooted in what scholars call the intolerance of uncertainty, which again is a phrase that I think Christians should be really thoughtful about. This overlaps with our faith in certain ways. There's a lot of life that's uncertain. My life has been awesome. I've managed to marry someone I deeply love. I have a job I really, I'm so happy to do what I do. If you had told me when I was a Houghton student in the late 90s, I'd be back here teaching, married with 5 kids, I would not have believed it, right? But that changes instantly, right? Like, that can change, and that's a reality. And most of us deal with that okay. Like, we recognize, yes, things can change. I can't control it. It's going to be okay, though. But for an anxious person, there's an intolerance of that. They can't tolerate that reality. It's scary to imagine all the things that are uncertain. So all kinds of symptoms are experienced because of the intolerance of uncertainty, but anxiety is one of them. Anxiety is on the rise. And just to be clear, this is not just a COVID thing. I was a kid in the 1980s, and they talk about how the average American child in the U.S. experienced more anxiety in the 1980s than child psychiatric patients in the 1950s. So even at the stage that I was a kid, the stage that all of my students certainly think was the good old days, anxiety was already really growing and really developing. Some more recent statistics: in 2018, 14.66% of U.S. adults 18 to 25 reported feeling anxious most of the time or all of the time in the previous month. And that's a lot. That's more than 1 out of 8 people that you know. Comparing that with just under 8% in 2008 is also interesting, because it makes us wonder if this is an increase in symptoms, or is this an increase in comfort talking about symptoms? And I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. That I certainly think there are more anxious feelings that people allow to rise to the surface for them, but there's also an increased comfort talking about it. This is one that's close to me. 42, this is 2021, so this is in the middle of the pandemic. 42% of high school students, quote, experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the last year, including 57% of female students. That means if you have a high school female student, right, in your church, the odds are better than 1 in 2 that she's experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the last year. So this is an incredible kind of reality right now. And while it's been growing for a long time, it certainly is more exponential at this point. That's a little about anxiety. What do people learn when they go for help? These are 6 kind of pillars of a certain kind of therapy for anxiety called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And one is to accept anxious feelings as normal and sometimes even positive. This is a hard one for us as Christians, and I acknowledge this is something we need to sort of struggle through, think through. But that idea of all of us do feel anxious sometimes. And that's not to say that every anxious feeling is warranted or that it's ideal, but it is to say it's normal. And really only once we've accepted that we're feeling something can we really start to do something productive with that feeling. Otherwise, we just kind of spin our wheels around and sort of think, I shouldn't feel anxious, I shouldn't feel anxious, I shouldn't feel anxious. And then we start feeling what I call meta-anxiety. We feel anxious about our anxiety, and that makes it much, much worse when we try to deal with it. So we have to accept that the feeling is there. Cognitive diffusion, I won't bore you about the specifics on this, but the idea that when I'm thinking something, that's just a thought. It's not a binding reality. The thought that I'm not good enough, the thought that people don't respect me, those sorts of things, those thoughts haunt, again, all of us sometimes, but anxious people a lot. And learning that that's not reality. That's something I think, but that's not a binding reality. You learn to be present, be where you are now. You learn self as context, which I think is actually very important for Christians to understand. This idea that when I'm feeling anxious, I'm not my anxious feelings. I am the one observing my anxious feelings, beginning to get a little distance between myself and those feelings. Um, Instead of simply wishing they weren't there, realizing, oh, I'm capable of looking at those and evaluating them for what they are. I'm not bound by them. Finally, and these should be very clear for us as Christians, clarifying our values, discovering what's important to us as believers, right? The gospel guides our values. If you go to a secular therapist, they may or may not guide you towards Christian values specifically. They might encourage you to clarify your personal values. But for us as believers, we certainly know that the values, that our values for life are built around the gospel in the person of Jesus. But then learning, number 6, that you are capable of committed action. Even when you're not feeling right, even when you're feeling anxious, you are capable of action that is consistent with your values. That's really important. And again, that's that's something most of us learned if you grew up in the church or if you grew up in a Christian home where your parents said, I don't care how you feel right now, we're going to church. Or I don't care how you feel right now, you can be nice to your sister. Those kinds of things are deeply consonant with the gospel. So again, I'm not saying all of these are uh, equally Christian kinds of values. Some more easily connect with the gospel than others. But it's important for us to put the gospel kind of into conversation with each of these, I think, in some ways, because there are some very, very helpful things here. And there are things that give anxious folks stability as they're processing what to do and how to kind of go forward with anxiety in their lives. So the book is kind of built around the question of this. If this is what you're learning when you go for help with anxiety, right, these 6 things, then how does a church service in an evangelical church context, the book's not specifically Wesleyan, but built around that kind of idea of there are many churches like ours in there, how does that church service reinforce or undermine the things that you're learning when you go for help with anxiety? In other words, just to put it bluntly, does church make it better or worse? And that idea of, we've all known people with mental health kind of disorders who have felt like church is kind of their lifeline. That's the one place where I fit. I feel good there. We've known other people who just say, this church doesn't see me for who I am. They are insisting on kind of going their own way, and I don't feel at home in that place. And so part of this book is a little bit of a love letter to my students who experience those things and wanting church to be kind of a safer place for them, or at least more aware of their reality. So the book's built around 5 main things. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about all 5, but liturgical time, how we mark time as Christians. Liturgical space, by which I mean like sanctuary design, decor, architecture. Music, church music. Preaching, and sacraments. Those are the 5 things. And again, they're all in the PowerPoint I'll share with you. But if we don't get to all of them today, that's going to be okay too. We'll just kind of see and watch our time. So first thing then, let's talk about, and my thing is freezing up again. Here we go. Good. Liturgical time, this first one. So if you want people to know they're part of a bigger story than themselves, you need to immerse them in a bigger story. And time's a big part of that. So when you're an anxious person, right, part of what you're feeling is your own internal world is just kind of taking over, right? And again, when you've kind of, when you've been in your bed and falling asleep at night or waking up the next morning and feeling like, I'm worried about what will happen today, often, if you're a Christian, you may begin to feel like, this is kind of selfish. Like, I know that there's so much more going on than how do my parents think about me? Or am I being a good parent? I know I sound middle-aged because I am caught between the generations right now, right? So like those kind of thoughts, you might feel selfish because you feel like there's so much going on in the world that's a bigger deal. And part of what's a relief for that is to know that I'm part of a bigger story, that my story means something when it's connected with that bigger story, but my story isn't the big story. And so liturgical time is a huge part of how we tell people they're part of a bigger story. And I look at that in 3 main ways. One is the Christian year. And I'll be honest with you, conversations about honoring the Christian year, the seasons of Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, arguments about whether the church should do that or not often really just boil down to kind of an argument about taste, I think, in a way that's not really helpful. um, it sometimes just boils down to like, this is the way this should happen, or this is the way, we should be freer to not have to observe those seasons. And I'm not really interested in that bigger, like, is this objectively right or objectively wrong? Sometimes it just boils down to a kind of like, I don't know. It's sometimes almost a class divide in churches about this. What I'm after is this idea of what the Christian year does really well is it allows us to find ourselves in the gospel story, right? What we're doing every year when we do the Christian year is we walk through this big story of the gospel, not in one service, but in months and in years. And we spend a long time, even in ordinary time when we're not doing any of those seasons, we spend a long time in one particular gospel and get to know that gospel. And so if you want people to understand they're part of a bigger story, you could do that by sort of saying, here's where we are in the story right now. And as we go through the year, we're telling this whole big story together. The story of the Christian year is an astounding story, right? This idea of Jesus coming to earth and the idea of Advent as kind of preparation for Christmas, which is when God enters the world, and Epiphany, when that takes place, when it moves from just one person, one baby in a manger, and his glory is revealed to all the world. And then it happens again at Lent. There's the season of preparation. There's Easter, what God does through the person of Jesus. And then there's Pentecost, when it goes forward to the whole world, right? And so us being able to tell that story again and again is really helpful. And it allows us to kind of get out of our own heads and into a bigger story. So that's one piece, the Christian year. Even more ancient than the Christian year, though, is the idea of the Christian week. So I do occasionally preach at, there's a Seventh-day Baptist church near us that worships on Saturday. And it's made me pause and wonder, why am I not a Seventh-day Christian? And part of that is the history of the church was built around this idea of the resurrection is so foundational that every Sunday we need to be talking about resurrection. We need to have a day to honor the resurrection every week. And that's an amazing idea. And some parts of the church still do that, right? If you go into many Black churches in the U.S., the sermon's not over until the resurrection has been talked about. But for many of us, right, who are not parts of those sorts of churches, we don't always think of the resurrection as very central to what we do on Sunday. So I really challenge churches to say, like, how often are you talking about resurrection? Like, if part of what we're all afraid of, that our anxiety is rooted in, is the uncertainty of death, right? The intolerance of what happens when we die. And we all feel that way sometimes. I think even the most deepest Christians I know, right, have this sense of sometimes a little fear about what happens when we die. And part of that, I think we can have a more intuitive sense that we are made for life beyond this when we're telling the resurrection story over and over and over again. So really focusing in on like trying to, there's been a lot of books written recently about recapturing Sabbath. Awesome. But I would love to see books that kind of recapture a better theology of Sunday, like that the resurrection means something, and it really is the heart of who we are as believers. Finally, the Christian day, I think, is important, and to realize that in many Christian traditions, the idea of what do we do every day as Christians goes out further than just the idea of like daily devos. And sometimes when I talk with students about devos, I let them talk sometimes, and sometimes for the first time they feel comfortable saying like, my devotional life is kind of a mess and I don't really know what to do. And part of that is because we kind of leave people on their own very often to kind of think through what works for them about devos. Go find a book that you like, something you connect with. And again, if part of what you're struggling with is my own inner experience is taking over, then sometimes having some help from the outside is really important. So I take, a group of students with some frequency to visit the Abbey of the Genesee, which is a monastery near my home, where those monks chant the Psalms every week. Every week they chant through the entire book of Psalms together. So my friend, Brother Christian, who has been there since 1953, has chanted the Psalms 3,700 times in his life, every Psalm. And because of that, he knows those psalms deep in his heart, and it's something that's outside of himself. He doesn't want to do that every day. He didn't want to do that every day when he was 22 when he entered the monastery, and he doesn't want to do it now that he's 93. But he does, and he builds his life around that practice that's kind of given to him by outside folks, and sort of said, "This is what we do here," and that's kind of given him guidance to order his day. So I'd love to think a little more about how we order our time. So that's some ideas about anxiety and time. Thinking a little bit about space. And I know that this is really contested terrain. So, I anticipate, and this is one of the ways that I hope that people understand, like, I never perceive my job as a college professor to be like anti the church. Does that make sense? Sometimes we think about like the church and the colleges as kind of almost at odds with each other. And I just think like, no, like I have the privilege of a certain kind of life here where I've got some time and space to think about things. And so I come up with some thoughts that I hope are helpful to you as you process, like, what do I want to do with this space? But I also acknowledge, like, some of this may be different than what you do. Very open to chat, very open to feedback about that. But I think space sometimes is something we don't think a lot about because, and here we Wesleyans are like other evangelicals in that we don't often think about space as really having meaning. We think any space, and this is true, any space can be God's space, right? And so we think like, we'll have a church here and this will be fine. We'll have a church here and this will be fine. You can have a church outside. You can have a church in an office park. You can have it, and that's all true. But it's important for us to think like, what is the space communicating to people, right? Every space that you're in says something. And when you're in a very secular space, part of what you're saying, and again, this is true, is God is present in all these spaces, right? And when you're present in a very churchy space, what you're saying is there's something special about this place where God lives. To be clear, churches exist on a spectrum, right? It's not like there's secular churches or churchy churches. There's lots of space in between. And most Wesleyan churches exist somewhere on that spectrum. Some look pretty churchy, but when we have Anglican and Catholic students at Houghton, even Houghton Wesleyan, which looks kind of high, we might say, for a Wesleyan church, doesn't look particularly high to my Anglican or Catholic friends. It just doesn't, even though for most of my Wesleyan friends, it's kind of the most ornate sanctuary that they've ever been in. So thinking about liturgical space just a little bit, many of our churches are totalizing spaces. And by that, I just mean it's increasingly common when we plant a new church or when we design worship space to want to be able to control particularly lighting. We don't have a lot of natural light generally coming in because we count on technology teams to there's something about lighting that we do a lot more with than we used to. And so because of that, it's important to have a space where we can reduce natural light in order to help that lighting happen. I want you to think just a little bit, though, about anxiety and totalizing spaces. In other words, like, what happens if you experience anxiety and then you go into a space that is kind of enclosed and lighting is really less something that's happening outside and pouring in and more something that's happening kind of from within the church? So a few things, right? One is, if you sort of are drawn into the space, ironically, you can have a little bit of kind of a sanctuary feel, right? It doesn't look churchy. It doesn't look like a sanctuary, but there's something kind of communicated by drawing a real strong distinction between the inside the church and outside the church that may make it hard to understand that God is also working outside there, right? There's this big experience that we have in the church. It can be hard to remember God's also working outside in that space. Second, people with anxiety are dropped into a very intense feeling place where others have access to their feelings. This is a really important thing, and I really would encourage Wesleyan pastors and those of us who plan worship to think a lot about why we use lighting the way we do. Lighting is a tremendously powerful tool. The kind of non-denom church growth churches like Willow Creek, right? They were among the first to really realize this, and they invested significant money in their lighting. And they went to learn from people at Disney and other sorts of places for how they could use lighting. And part of that is this sense of lighting does allow us to guide others' feelings. I'm very careful not to use the word manipulate because that's, how do I put this? I think that's always been part of things. This idea that lighting shapes our mood is something we understand. Like churches historically, right? The churchiest churches recognize that. That's why they use lighting the way they do in grand cathedrals. That's part of why stained glass is what it is. Like when we talk about stained glass, sometimes we think, oh, it's like a pedagogical tool to teach people things. Yes, but it's also something which simply, in many cases, stained glass is much more abstract. And light pours through it, and we see that light and we say, that's beautiful. It communicates something about who God is. And so I'm not saying that lighting in and of itself, guiding people's feelings through lighting, is manipulative or evil or wrong. What I am saying is it's a really powerful tool. And I quote some dissertations in my book that are folks who have kind of done lighting with some large churches and the kinds of ways that people who are responsible for that lighting talk about it. And often they'll say, like, I wanted so-and-so to feel a certain kind of way, and so this is what we did with the lights. Well, that's a lot, right? That's a lot for an anxious person who's kind of like at odds with their feelings right now. And they're learning, right? Part of what they're learning for help with anxiety is my feelings don't have to run the show, right? My feelings are not determinative. And yet, right, here in this kind of space, sometimes it feels like feelings really are kind of determinative. And so it's important to think through things like, well, how are we training the people who are using lighting, who are leading our lighting decisions? Are they aware of the kinds of issues that are at play? I'm not saying that every lighting tech has to go out and get a Master of Divinity degree, although it's a great idea for West Sem if they want to start a church lighting track. But I think that idea of like, I need to know that the people who are running the lighting are thinking more than just kind of like what works, and they're thinking about the question like, why do I think this works? Like, what is it that I'm trying to get to work? What feelings am I trying to inspire, and why? That's a really important thing to think about, and particularly then to think about the people for whom those feelings are kind of vulnerable in tender spaces. In many of these types of churches, stages are bright and lights are low. That also means that people have a hard time connecting with people around them. So there's kind of a logic built into many churches' lighting practices, which it further isolates the individuals in the congregation into kind of a perceived kind of one-on-one interaction with the stage. Does that make sense? It's less about who's around me. I can't even see them in many cases. I might be able to see 2 or 3 people close to me, but I can't see people across the way. But I can see what's going on stage. And so there's also this something kind of isolating about that. It makes the experience into something that's more one-on-one and less communal than can be helpful for someone with anxiety, right? It's helpful if you experience anxiety to see a wide variety of people doing a wide variety of things, and frankly, feeling a wide variety of feelings, right? Often I feel like I'm doing a service for the anxious people in my church when I have to like stare daggers at my 13-year-old because she won't quit fighting with my 11-year-old in church, right? Like that idea of like, okay, we're not all super pious right now. We're, all of us are just trying to make this work, and not all of us are kind of in this moment right now. And that's helpful for someone who is also just kind of learning how to get through in life. And so these kind of lighting decisions have real consequences.
Michael, can I ask you a
Sure.
question?
Yeah.
You're getting ready to
You're fine.
suggest.
Mhm.
So what about? I mean, you're never going to have the 100% everybody's happy.
Sure.
Would you say that it's more common that the maybe darker lighting is unhelpful for a person struggling with anxiety? But I also know that there are some people, maybe they're kind of feeling anxious about going to church in general. And so the darker room, they kind of feel like they can be there and more anonymously.
Yep.
Do you, in your research, is it still more the majority of people would do better in a lighter space, or is it too case by case to be able to answer that?
I mean, I think it's case by case. I mean, I do think when we think kind of what's the ultimate goal, it's good to think for how do we get there with these two, right? And so we're thinking about people's comfort in the moment. We're also thinking like eventually what we want that person to do who wants to remain anonymous, eventually, whether or not in that one, like we don't want to push too hard, but eventually we want them to learn they have a home in the body. And so that's part of why I privilege that here, more so as kind of a long-term goal than just a kind of what works to get them through that service. But you're exactly right. Like for many people, even for people who aren't anxious, there's something about the perceived anonymity of church that feels good the first time you walk in.
And
Um,
I love that long term, right? 'Cause
sure.
sometimes very short sighted. So you're helping push. You got to think long term. So what are you teaching them if you're always helping them feel a little more comfortable in the dark, but you're not helping them join the community and move beyond it?
Sure.
Love.
Yeah, thanks. No, and Willow Creek is actually again kind of instructional here. I mean, the experience with Willow Creek of kind of building around people's initial felt desire for anonymity, right? Like that was it. Like we're planning this non-denominational worship space without all the churchy things that make people feel uncomfortable. We're giving them a space where there's stadium seating, so there's armrests between them and people so they don't have to be cheek to cheek on a pew. We're building this for those folks. They discovered like it's really hard to move people beyond that initial thing. And so again, finding some way to have a kind of a long-term vision, I think is pretty important.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts on kind of my thoughts on what to do. First, I think turning up the lights is important, like just having a little space for people to connect more broadly. I'm a natural light person, so when I was dean of the chapel here, I was I was kind of known as the natural light Nazi because often people would naturally want to kind of we have giant windows really high, I don't know, maybe 30 feet tall, 20 feet, I don't know exactly, real tall and all clear glass. And it can be a little hard to display things on a screen with that kind of thing, but I was often always the one who would say, "We need to pull those up. We need to pull those up." So, wanting the light to come in. But I also think this other question is important. Like, if there is a way in which people are really connecting with what's going on the stage and on the screen, to what extent are those representing everybody? In other words, like, do you see up there? Do you see old people? Do you see fat people? Who are the people that you see up there, and are they only a certain kind of person doing a certain kind of thing? Having a really broad base, I think, also helps an anxious person to know I belong here too, because it's not just for beautiful people doing beautiful things; it's for us together. So I talk about, like, for example, like what do you use stage and screen for? Do you use it to make baptisms more visible? That's awesome, right? Like that idea of like bringing people into the life of the body that they can see more closely. But if it kind of reifies kind of hierarchies in the body, I'm a little more concerned about it. So that's some thoughts there. This will just show in your, you can see this. I won't leave it up here long, but this is some of the quotes that I saw that just talked about like the way lighting directors often will want to choose things in order to shape feelings. And again, for some of you, you will look at that and be like, "That's awful," because I can't believe people use lights to do that. And others of you are like, "Yeah, that's normal." But I hope it's challenging to you to just think through like, okay, we are making these decisions about people's feelings. What are the ingredients to those decisions? Like, what are we really after long term in people's lives? So, some thoughts about that. Some thoughts about church music, even more controversial. So, people with anxiety are learning that their feelings are just feelings, not binding realities. But sometimes church music can leave you with the opposite impression, right? God is with you when you feel something. And I'll just kind of stop here and just kind of be confessional for a minute and say, like, for me, a whole lot of why I think I wound up studying worship, why I went into ministry, lots of it was built around a time when I was a college student and didn't necessarily feel like I was doing enough because I didn't seem to be feeling what other people were feeling. There were other people, I was one of the people at Houghton as a young student who cared deeply about the gospel. I was the one leading Bible studies. I was our class chaplain, that kind of thing. But there were also people kind of in the burgeoning worship movement of the 90s who just seemed to be like in touch with God in a way that I wasn't. And they would often feel it really out loud. And for a while I would say like, am I enough? I'm not feeling what this other person's feeling exactly. Should I be honest about that? Should I pretend to feel that? Do I really feel it down deep and I've got to unearth it? Those are all things that are really part of my own journey and part of what led me, I think, eventually to write this book. It's very important to me to think about the way in which our feelings are our feelings and can be very helpful. We're Wesleyans. And so this idea that our faith is not just something in our head, right? Our faith is something that we feel, and our faith is something that we intuit the world differently because we're Christians, and we walk through the world differently. But I also felt like there's not this neat one-to-one analogy between what a person's feeling in the moment and whether or not they really know the Holy Spirit. And 25 years of watching those the varying journeys of those young people who were leading worship, and in those days, some of whom are in the church still and some of whom aren't, um, has reassured me that all the people who seem to be miles ahead of me spiritually, um, they didn't necessarily turn out more like Jesus than I did. Does that make sense? Like that there were people kind of all over that spectrum who ended up following Jesus, and many people all over that spectrum who didn't. Um, so at any rate, this idea of feeling, I just think, is really important. So often people are thought to be good worship musicians if their music makes people feel a certain way. We should also realize the way music induces feeling is really culturally induced. So I can get up there and sing praise and worship songs from the 90s. Like I remember singing Shout to the Lord every week in chapel, right, all the time. And students now think of it as kitschy, disconnected, what we do on Oldies Day, that kind of thing. And part of that is just music changes, chords change, our sense of like when this chord happens, like, for example, today, an octave jump just means like the Holy Spirit is really here. Like I'm feeling it really deeply, so deeply, I can't keep singing low. I got to start singing high. And that's not something we felt in the 90s, right? Like that's just different. And so, to think about like, how did we get those feelings about what music does are important questions. So some 5 things I encourage people to think about music. First, edit the script a little bit. I say there's kind of a script to the way music works, where we say like, this kind of song makes people feel a certain kind of way. You do some of these slow songs first, or you do a fast song first to kind of wind people up, then some slow songs, and then a fast song. Like, let's think about that script and kind of what's behind it, and let's edit. I'm not saying you have to write my script, right? You don't have to do it just the way I would do it, but let's think about like, how did we get the script we have, and why do we like that script? Are there things we would change about it? 2, got to realize the strengths and weaknesses of feeling God's presence. I really want to see the Wesleyan world grapple a little more with the connection between a strangely warmed heart and a holy life. Does that make sense? Like I want to see a connection between God reassures me with his deep presence. I feel him. I know him near. And because of that, I have now the security of knowing who I am, and I can walk in the world in a holy way. When I discover there's something in my life that is jarring me and it's discordant from someone who would say that God's presence is living in them, because I know that God's Spirit is living in me, because I know that I'm forgiven and loved, then I am totally free to follow Jesus. I am totally free. And I want us to think more about like, how do we get to that place of secure, committed, confident, fruitful action? That's the result of the strangely warmed heart. And I want us to think less about the warmth and more about like, does that warmth lead to secure, committed, confident, fruitful action? So I think that's a pretty important kind of idea. 3rd, choose keys in music that let people sing. Like if you want people to be involved and feeling like they're participating in making this, you got to make it so that they can do that. Hang on to songs longer. I'll turn you over to Mike Tapper at some point about this, and Mark Jollicool and the others who have been working on that stuff. But that's really important, I think. The idea that what it means to connect with Jesus is not changing as much as the pop music charts are changing, right? Like that idea of like, we can hang on to songs a little longer, and we can appreciate music kind of across generations with a little more clarity and a little more intentionality, I think is very important. Finally, I love the idea of leaning into as if songs. If part of what we're after is not just feeling warm about what is, but warm about what God is going to do, then let's sing music that sort of focuses on us, on what God is going to do. And I cry every time I sing Speak, O Lord, at least when we sing all 3 verses, which end, Speak, O Lord, till your church is built and the earth is filled with your glory. And I look around at the people in the church, and they are paying varying degrees of attention. Some of them are disciplining their kids. Some of them are on their phones. So, I look around and I'm like, God, we are so far from that. But I'm moved by what you're calling us to, right? I'm moved by this idea of a life that's bigger and caught up in this great story of what you're doing. So I want to lean into music like that draws my feelings, not just from what I'm experiencing now, but the discord between what I'm feeling now and what God has promised. So an as if song, I think, is part of that.
Michael,
Yeah, go ahead.
before you move on, I don't want to.
Good.
So number 4, the hanging on to songs longer.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that's just because, and if you're you're kind of constantly worrying about what the next thing is. If you're not familiar with a song because you've never sang it before, because they're constantly throwing new songs at
Correct.
you, you're just distracted from what's actually the purpose of the worship service. Am I
Yeah,
hitting it right?
correct. Yeah. I didn't talk long enough about it, but yeah, that idea of like, um, if I'm an anxious person, beginning to feel kind of confident and comfortable in who I am in the body, then I need to know that the people who are leading me are with me, right? And when it's always new and when it's always sort of pulling me along, there's part of the way that you might feel like, do they respect kind of what the Spirit is doing, has done in my life before or until now? And so just being able to, and again, I'm not making an argument here for kind of getting stuck in 1700s music or 1800s or not. It's just saying like these songs, particularly the ones that are about our experience, are often very precious to people, precious ways of narrating our experience. And people need to see their own experience honored, and songs that we hang on to are part of the way that we do that. So
Right.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last quick thing, we won't get on too far into this, but just some preaching stuff. Like we tend to think that the problem with preaching is anger today, like that preaching is too angry. But I think there's more than that. I think I call it a kind of haze of unreality in a lot of preaching. There are lots of things I feel like when I'm tempted to preach a sermon on a specific topic, there are kinds of things that I feel like I should say. And there are lots of sermons, I think, that just kind of amount to people piecing together things that they feel like they should say in sermons rather than kind of this kind of deep, thoughtful wrestling with the scripture. And I think particularly about anxiety, like the kind of common Christian cultural script around anxiety is, I mean, it might not be wrong to be anxious, but it's wrong to let anxiety kind of dominate your life. And that may well be true. There are elements of truth in that, right? But there are ways that sometimes we just kind of say these things without really thinking like, what's that mean for the people who are listening? Um, so, I mean, I think, as I say here, like, it's not good for anxious people who need to know. Sorry, I can't even see what I wrote there because I'm covered up with, but need to know, like, learn to be comfortable with their feelings, learning to be uncomfortable in places where people are not their authentic selves. Like, I want to hear preaching that is authentic and honest and true to the text and true to the people I'm talking to. So the kind of format I set up here is this idea of preaching should be faithful to Scripture. You have to preach the Bible as it is, not like you wish it was. And, many of you, I'm sure, have divorced folks in your church, and Jesus teaching about divorce can challenge, right? Like, how do I talk about that in a congregation where there are divorced folks, right? And part of that, sometimes, like I certainly pastored a church like that, and part of it was that people themselves were very afraid to look at what Jesus said about divorce. And so you, as the preacher, though, get to preach that text and you get to talk about it. And part of what you can do, it doesn't mean beating people over the head that they've been divorced. But as we look at what Jesus says about divorce, part of it is very liberating for someone who's been through a divorce, because we live in a culture that has taught them, oh, this is just kind of a normal life passage. Some people go through this. It's normal. It's something even to be celebrated in some circumstances. Whereas you're free to say, oh, I'm looking at the scripture and I'm seeing you've been through something really painful. You've been through something this is not part of how God planned. And so as you heal from that, I'm glad to walk with you through that. And the Bible is your friend as you go through that. The Bible is not something that you need to be scared to look at because you're not sure what it's going to say to you. It can be your friend and your guide as you go through that really painful thing. So you preach it, you have to be, if you also are afraid, like your people are, to talk about those passages, people are going to conclude, oh, I can't look at the Bible either. The Bible is scary. Not even my preacher will talk about it. Not even my preacher will talk about this really hard thing. But if you do, then they will discover the Bible is a friend for them too. Second, this is really important for anxious people. You need to be faithful to yourself. So I invite people, like when I was dean of the chapel here, we always had people coming in to speak to young people. And sometimes I would have to say, look, I don't need you to pretend that you're 21 to talk to them. They don't need to hear the latest cool slang from you. They don't need to hear you, they don't need to see you wearing skinny jeans. They don't need to see any of that. They need to see you be the person that you are, not the person you wish you were. And part of why that's really important for anxious people is that's what they're learning, right? They're learning it's okay to be the me I am. I don't have to have been perfect. I don't have to earn other people's love. I need to be the person I am. And so people will know, especially if you're preaching in a place for a long time, people will know if you're faithful to yourself or not. They will begin to see, is this really the person who they claim to be? Finally, faithful to your listeners. And this means for anxious people, like if you have not experienced clinical anxiety, it means having kind of like a listening posture. Um, you know, how do I say this? When I've had students who really care about Jesus and also would describe themselves as anxious or having anxiety, when they hear someone get up in the pulpit and have a rather straightforward interpretation of be anxious for nothing, and conclude that anxious feelings are thereby always wrong, um, it's not like they get up and walk out of the chapel service, but they do just kind of turn their ears off because they think, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And that may not be the right conclusion, but they've just sort of said, like, this person hasn't been where I've been. They obviously don't understand what I'm experiencing. And so just take some time to learn a little bit about what the experience of anxiety is like. If it's true that half of the young women in your church who are high school age have experienced persistent feelings of sadness in the last year, you got to think about, like, I've got to talk to them. I can't talk around them. I can't talk over them. I'm talking to them. And that's really, really, really crucial. And so, I think, for example, about that anxiety text about be anxious for nothing, it's really liberating to hear, like, oh, Paul used that same Greek word to talk about the anxiety that he experienced every day for the churches he planted. He talked about, like, I've been stoned, I've been shipwrecked, it's been awful. And besides that, I have daily anxiety because of all the churches. And it's like, oh, the same Paul who said be anxious for nothing also said this. Whatever he meant by be anxious for nothing, it couldn't just mean that my anxious feelings are sinful. Paul experienced that on an ongoing basis. And in fact, later on, Paul uses that same word to describe the kind of care that we're supposed to have for each other. That we should also kind of bear each other's burdens and care for each other, which means stepping into each other's experience and feeling, again, not feeling afraid necessarily, but recognizing the anxieties that other people experience, stepping in a caring way into the middle of that so that their anxieties become yours. You bear it with them. That really changes when we go a little deeper into the text. And so be faithful to the people that you're talking to. I recognize we're 152 here. So should I finish up with sacraments? Is that good, Carla? Or should anything you want to?
No,
Okay.
the comments have been amazing, and I don't think anyone wants you to stop yet. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, that's not how everybody feels, but okay. Yeah, I'll go past this, but just talking briefly about sacraments here at the end. It's sort of funny. I hope that people involved will forgive me. But so I was a Baptist before becoming a Wesleyan, and Baptists are not sacramental. We don't have sacramental language. We talk about having ordinances. And ordinances just means kind of the reason we do baptism and communion is because Jesus said to. He ordained it. So just like local municipalities have ordinances, like you can't keep chickens in your yard, we Baptists would baptize and give communion because that's what Jesus said to. And we didn't understand it as meaningfully or reliably sharing the grace of God with each other, right? Part of the reason I joined the Wesleyan Church is because I was beginning to become more sacramental. I was beginning to realize, like, no, there's something more going on when we baptize and when we share communion than just obeying Jesus. Yes, we're obeying Jesus, but there's something deeper than that happening. Now, sometimes, and again, please forgive me, there are times where I've realized as I've come into the Wesleyan Church that many Wesleyans are essentially Baptist when they think about the sacraments. Like the things that they think of as happening, they think of baptism as kind of only kind of an expression of what's happened in our, it's our way of saying something to God and saying something to each other. And we think of communion sometimes as kind of like an object lesson that Jesus gave us about kind of how things are and a visual aid to kind of understand the nature of his sacrifice. When in reality, we have language that says something more is happening. God is here when we do these things. And so I want us to kind of get beyond just thinking about the inner experience. This means something to me because it's powerful to me. Again, when we get stuck there, that's what's hard for an anxious person. Right? Because they're locked in their own inner experience. They're unable, right? They're having a hard time stepping out of their inner experience. And so like their question about like, am I ready to be baptized or not? That's a hard question for an anxious person to answer. Why? Because you can go round and round in your head asking if I'm ready or not, right? How do I know? Right? And the question of like, if you take communion in an unworthy way, you eat and drink, if you'll give me the King James, eateth and drinketh damnation. Like, that's heavy. How do I know whether I have confessed enough? Right. And so we've got to get out of just our inner experience and into this idea that God is really doing something in the sacraments. So what do I think this looks like? Just a little bit of stuff here. Yeah, said some of that stuff already. Looking outward being really important. So to get out of our own experience and into what God is doing. So to do this in communion, I would really encourage you every time you do communion to have a Thanksgiving prayer. You know, in many liturgical churches, the idea of the Great Thanksgiving is this long prayer. And in many churches, it's long and it's prescribed, it's written out, and it kind of narrates all of salvation history. You know, God created people with dignity and purpose. We fell away. God created a covenant with his people. We failed to live up to the covenant. God sent his son. He lived, he taught, he healed, he died, he rose again, he gave us a spirit, right? And if you do that in a liturgical way, that's awesome. Like, you can do that way, but you can also do that extemporaneously. Like, when you come to the table, not just saying like, be sure you've confessed everything, do that, but then also say like, God, the fact we're here at this table is a miracle, and look at all you've done, right? And part of what you're trying to do is get people out of their own head and into this bigger story. So Great Thanksgiving is a way. And in baptism, right? Highlight God's washing and forgiving work, right? Go beyond, this is my testimony. We don't just want a sincere expression from the person being baptized, but we also want to tell people, like, when you come to be baptized, you are presenting yourself to God and as a pledge to God for all time to work on you, right? You're saying, I'm coming here in faith that you're going to wash me. And as we walk down into that water, it's prefiguring all that God is going to do in your life, right? It's honoring, yes, what God has done to that point, but it's not just honoring the God who brought you to this point where you're ready to say yes. It's stepping into that washing stream, that healing stream, right? Where he says, this is the work that's going to be part of your life from now on. Now on, you're going to be a person who bathes in grace. So looking outwards is really important. So last bit here is just, worship isn't helpful for anxious people when they're told they have to feel a certain way, and when the visible leaders look and act the same, and when the leaders are not acquainted with the experience of anxiety. Instead, it becomes a healing space for anxious people when they're allowed to feel what they're feeling, and when they're given many healthy and diverse models for how to live secure lives and follow Jesus in committed, wholehearted ways. So that's a trip through the book. You know, if it whets your appetite to want to buy the book, awesome. If you've gotten enough, that's fine too. I'm glad to share it with you. But I think that's all I got. Carla, any questions or anything else here at the end?
And no questions, just a huge thank you to you, Michael. I would encourage everyone listening to purchase the book. We've included the link on the comments. And if you're listening to this after the live, get the book. This is amazing stuff. I feel like I went to church and to school all at the same time over the last 45 minutes. It
That's how
was
a Christian college should feel. So good. I'm glad you felt that way.
absolutely. I'm excited for the students at Houghton that get to learn under you, and I'm so thankful that you felt called to write this book so that those of us that are no longer in college can still learn this essential topic. I loved that stat that you shared at the beginning, and this idea that maybe anxiety is on the rise, and maybe it's also that people are more willing to talk about it. And so we as pastors, we need to know how we can serve and love the people. And there are probably pastors listening that they themselves struggle with anxiety. And
For sure.
the worship service that you get to be a part of, that you get to plan, is an opportunity to speak to your own soul as well as to help those around you. So I just want to say a very big thank you to Michael. And also including in the comments, we will also post again the links that were mentioned earlier. If you want any more information from Houghton College, as you can see, they have amazing professors and just a great school that can teach us so much. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for listening and being a part of this conversation. How can we serve and love and equip the people that God has blessed us with in our congregations and the people that have yet to come into our doors, but we get the opportunity to serve them? I want to also invite you to join us next month on October 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern, we are going to be joined by Indiana Wesleyan University and Dr. Miranda Cruz. She wrote the book Faithful Politics. And I don't know if you know this, but there's an election happening very soon. And so we're not going to talk about Republican or Democrat. We're not going to tell you who to vote for. We're just going to help anyone listening. And Miranda does an amazing job in her book, share how are we faithful to our Savior in the political season? How can we serve our church? So that's October 22nd at 1 p.m. Thank you for joining us. Everyone, have a wonderful day.